Hello, and welcome back to biology. Today we want to talk about the macromolecules, which are the building blocks of everything that is alive. But before we do that, I just want to remind you of the biological hierarchy. In our class, we're going to talk about ecosystem, but remember, we can go beyond that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, the biomes and biosphere. But the ecosystem, that is where you're having the living and non-living organizations, community. This is only the living things, and it's all the species. Populations are a single species. An organism is a one individual. They are made up of organ systems, which are made up of organs, which are made up of tissues, which are made up of cells, and those cells are made up of these macromolecules, and those macromolecules are made up of atoms. Okay. So we talk about the cell, and we're going to talk about the cell a lot later on. You can see that you can just break these things down and down and down. And this is a nice little overview of what we're going to talk about throughout this little conversation. So first things, organic molecules, what are they, right? Cells, it turns out, are mostly water, right? And then carbon-based molecules. Carbon is really cool. It has a valence of 4, so it forms all kinds of different large, complex molecules. I mean, there's a huge diversity here, and because carbon is so special in that way, it's what allows us to have this huge diversity of life. And just to give you an idea, the carbons themselves, you can have different numbers of them, right? You can have different types of bonds, you can have different branches, you can even have rings, and we haven't even started adding functional groups, right? Things that have something other than carbon and hydrogen. And those are going to go back to those things that we talked about before in the nutrient cycles, right? The nitrogen, the phosphorus, the sulfur, and all of the other little guys that you need, the minerals and the vitamins and stuff. But anyway, remember, N-CHOPs are the big elements that you're going to find in these organic molecules, but C and H, those would be the biggest, okay? All right, so functional group, the arrangement of functional groups is really, really important, okay? And you can have this very same carbon structure. Anytime you see these rings and you just have like some corner or a bond here, this is going to be carbon and hydrogen, okay? And here there's a deviation from the hydrogen being attached to this carbon, and that is going to be this hydroxyl group right here. Up here you have a methyl group and another hydroxyl group. Well, it turns out that if you make this a double bonded oxygen and add a methyl group here, you go from the hormones that allow you to become female to the hormones that allow you to become male. And that would be an outcome that is really a huge difference simply by changing, adding, taking away various functional groups. Okay. First question, which of the following is not one of the significant macromolecules found in organisms? All of these are complex. All of these are large molecules. Well, the 4 biological molecules are going to be the carbohydrates, the proteins, the nucleic acids, and the lipids. Dioxins, they are in fact a very large molecule, a whole family of molecules actually, but they turn out to be pollutants, so they are not part of this group. Okay, so here is what I just said, the 4 categories of large molecules. And when you're building these large molecules, you of course start with smaller parts. And so you have a monomer, which is a small unit, and you start hooking those together and you get polymers. And so a really good example of that would be, and I'm going to start at the bottom here, but the nucleotides build nucleic acids. That is the bases, the nitrogenous bases in DNA and RNA, if you know what I'm talking about, that build DNA and RNA. Amino acids, right? And sometimes you'll see those, oh, you got to get enough amino acids, blah, blah, blah. Why? Because they build proteins. Fatty acids, right, like your omegas and things like that, very exciting. They build lipids. Your simple sugars build carbohydrates. And again, we're going to talk about this as we go through, but you can see that each of these vital macromolecules is made of smaller units. Okay, so the monomers that make up the polymeric carbohydrates, like starch, are called, well, starch is a carbohydrate, so it is made of simple sugars. Another word for sugar that we hear a lot is saccharin, right? Means sweet, although saccharin, when you talk about an actual thing, is something different. But when we say, oh, that's very saccharin, we're talking about sugar. Mono means one. Monosaccharides would be those simple sugars. Now, glucose is a very simple sugar, right? But the whole category of those are called monosaccharides. Okay, whoops. All right, so this is just a big overview of the monomers and the polymers and how they, build to get whatever you need. These are the building blocks. This is the ATP part, and we've talked about ATP in respiration. It's included in the organic compounds part because, of course, it's really important. It is not one of the 4 macromolecules that we're talking about. Okay, so the major source of energy for a cell in terms of, now we know ATP, but we store energy. What do we do, what do we use, what do we make to get that energy? These are all sugars, by the way. Well, glucose, right? Remember, photosynthesis, that is going to be the outcome of that, glucose. And we can use glucose and we can store a lot more energy by hooking those together to build starches, right? And glycogen, right, is a starch. Okay, so glucose is going to be the simplest of all the sugars. You got it right here. Fructose, galactose, those are also really simple sugars. Ribose and deoxyribose are sugars that are actually part of the structure of DNA and RNA with nucleic acids. Lactose you're familiar with, that's the milk sugar. Sucrose is table sugar, okay? And again, you can use all of these to build starch and actually cellulose. And cellulose is the woody structure in plants. Okay, so what is the function of carbohydrates? There's actually 2 major functions. You have the energy, right? It's energy storage. These are high energy bonds. And then you have cell-to-cell communication, which part of that cell-to-cell communication is also the identification of those cells. Okay, and then here, I think this is really cool. This is the cell membrane, and we'll be talking about this more later on, but you can see here are some lipids, right, and they will face each other, and so you have this hydrophobic center. Again, we'll talk about this later on. But embedded in this lipid bilayer, okay, are all kinds of things. You've got proteins, and then you have an oligosaccharide here. That would be sugar, right, on there. So you have these little attachments onto these proteins. Okay, so glucose and fructose both have the formula C6H12O6, but the atoms in these 2 compounds are arranged differently. Glucose and fructose are known as, and this is a review from chemistry, they are isomers. Isomers have the same functional group, right? They have the same chemical formula, right? But the places and the structure are actually different, and that gives them different characteristics, right? So fructose is a lot sweeter than glucose, and that is because they have this different arrangement and it behaves a little bit differently. Okay, next group, lipids, right? These come in 3 main groups. They're going to be your triglycerides, your phospholipids, and your steroids. And your triglycerides, this is going to be like your body fat. It's where we're going to store most of our energy. It's great for insulation. It's great for padding. And it's really good for waterproofing, actually. Your waxes are triglycerides. Phospholipids are going to be those fats that are in the cell membrane that we talked about. And then steroids can also be part of membranes, cellular membranes like cholesterol, but they regulate, the big deal about steroids is they regulate processes like metabolism, the immune response, and reproduction. Lipids are a little bit different than some of the other things because they are nonpolar, so they only dissolve in nonpolar substances. They do not dissolve in water, and that has to do with that oily, greasy kind of texture that we got. Okay, and again, here's just that same picture. And the phospholipids, we have some of those down here, but these, that phospholipid bilayer, that is what actually makes the cell membrane itself. Okay, all right. Next category are protein, and we're doing this pretty quickly, so just know we're kind of going through fast. Proteins, what are they used for? Building muscle, catalyzing reactions, chemical messengers, structure and repair. Well, you might say building muscle because that's when we talk about proteins, but it turns out that all of these are what proteins are used for. Okay, and so the obvious structure, repair, okay, so your fingernails, feather, hair, all of that, that's all going to be protein. Keratin, for instance, is your fingernails and hair. They are enzymes that catalyze reaction, okay, so like Lipase breaks down lipids. That is a protein. Okay, amylase breaks down starches in your body. Those are both enzymes. They are proteins. Okay, hormones, right? Estrogen, testosterone, all of those things. Those are chemical messengers that trigger or regulate various processes. Okay, carriers, hemoglobin that carries the oxygen in your blood. That's a protein. Right? So here's just another list, and some of these we had before, but you have protein everywhere. You need lots of protein, protein, all the time, protein, right? And so if you're not getting enough protein, it's not just that you're not building enough muscle, you're actually restricting all of these activities. Okay, so protein structure. So proteins are made up of amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, okay? And you do not have to know the 20 different amino acids. We're going to go through transcription, translation, all that good stuff, DNA and how that is the instruction manual for your proteins, basically. We'll talk about all of that, but you don't have to memorize the amino acids or anything like that. Okay. So you have these amino acids. They bind together to make polypeptides, and then those get folded in the appropriate way. So here's your polypeptide to make the final product of the protein. And here actually is a chart of the 20 amino acids, and you can see that some of them are similar, some of them are very similar in chemical structure, so they have similar behaviors. That's going to be helpful when we start talking about things later on. Okay, so the primary structure of a protein is just those amino acids bonded together in a polypeptide chain, and that's the primary structure. The secondary structure, these molecules have various attractions to each other, and that causes them to fold in certain ways. And the next level of organization for proteins, the secondary structure, is either this lovely coil right here, or it's this interesting like pleated, folded sheet of protein. Okay, then there's going to be a tertiary structure, and those sheets or those coils, or sheets and coils depending on what you're talking about, they can fold, they can form little pockets, they can make columns like barrels that things can pass through. It's really actually cool. So they twist around. And then the quaternary structure, this may be this may happen, it may not happen, but this is where two of those tertiary or more of those tertiary structures actually bind together, and so you get this whole like unit of proteins working together. Okay, now why am I telling you about this, and why do you care that you've got these coils and sheets, and those coils and sheets fold up and twist, and they may bind with other things? That would be primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. The structure actually dictates the function, okay? And so what those proteins look like in the final, outcome is really vital to whatever they're doing. So if you have changes in those proteins, right, then that may change the folding. Doesn't always, but most of the time it does. And so that can actually limit or cease the function of that protein. A really good example is sickle cell anemia. Hemoglobin, right, is this great little structure here, but you have a 1 amino acid substitution, and so instead of getting beautiful normal cells, you get these weird like flattened out comma cells, okay? And so these like little rods. This is not going to carry oxygen. This is a cute little oxygen carrying basket. No, yes, no, yes, no oxygen, poor function, right? And so it's a big deal. Even one little change can have huge ramifications. Okay, last one, nucleic acids. The structure, these are really large, complex organic molecules, but they are so important because they are actually the information of the cell. They store everything that cell is. And in complex organisms, they store everything in all of the cells, in the entire organism. Every little cell has a like book of all of the instructions, and so that's what nucleic acids build, are basically instruction manuals, which come in the form of DNA and RNA. RNA, interestingly enough, can actually also act like an enzyme, so in some ways it can act like a protein in that respect. DNA doesn't do that, but RNA's pretty special. Okay, so nucleotides, DNA an RNA are made up of nucleotides. Those consist of that sugar I was telling you about, the ribose or deoxyribose, phosphate group, and a nitrogen-containing base. So again, you're going to see these nutrient cycle elements that we talked about before. Those get together, and there are 4 different kinds for DNA. There are also 4 different kinds for RNA, giving you a total of 5 different kinds of nucleotides. Cytosine, adenine, and guanine are universal. They are in both DNA and RNA. However, thymine is only found in DNA, and uracil replaces the thymine in RNA. And so you can actually tell if you have a DNA strand or an RNA strand based on the nucleotides that are in it. Okay, so they bind together, but because they're different shapes, right? Adenine and thymine make 2 bonds, and guanine and cytosine have a triple bond, right? So there's 3 bonds here. This 2 available bonding places does not match with this 3 available bonding places. And so adenine will always bond with thymine, and cytosine will always bond with guanine. I don't know why this is not capitalized, and I don't really know why these are capitalized, because you don't have to do that, but you probably want to be consistent, not like I was there. Okay, so you've got hydrogen bonds, and so you remember these are nice little bonds between your hydrogen and something else. Here it's going to be hydrogen and nitrogen. Here it's hydrogen and oxygen, but it's either going to be hydrogen, oxygen, or hydrogen and nitrogen. So these all bind together, and you get this lovely little phosphate structure here, and that's what you can see right here. That's the backbone. And the rungs of the ladder, this double helix, are going to be the nucleotides that are bonded together. Now, remember, they bond complementary, right? So, if I have a DNA molecule that is AATGCGA, what would be the strand that would bond to this strand? Well, we know that A and T bind together, and C and G bind together. So A, T, so just this one, A, T, T, A, G, C, C, G, G, C, A, T. And so the answer is number 1. Yay. All right, now RNA is going to be single-stranded, whereas DNA is going to be double-stranded, and so you actually do have 2 strands that are matched, they're complementary to each other, and then RNA just has the 1, which makes it able to do all sorts of other things that we'll talk about later on. Okay, so when we start talking about all of this stuff, this is going to tie into the whole nutrient conversation. Organisms are actually classified by their source of energy and their source of carbon, because in order to make all of these macromolecules, they have to be bringing in carbon, right? Well, plants, your phototrophs, and not all phototrophs are plants, but some of those phototrophs, they're going to get energy from light, okay? And then you have, out of those groups, autotrophs and heterotrophs, okay? Your autotrophs get their carbon from carbon dioxide, okay? These guys are going to get their carbon from organic compounds, so they're going to eat other things, okay? Now, chemotrophs, right, are going to get energy from chemical compounds, okay? So this is going to be like your deep sea vent guys, and they're all going to be heterotrophs because none of them are going to be photosynthesizers. And then those you can divide up into your lithotrophs. These are guys who get their energy from inorganic compounds, and organotrophs. These are guys who get their energy from organic compounds. I'm not expecting you to know each and every one of these terms. The point of this is that your carbon has got to come from somewhere, and there are different sources to that. Okay, so what do? You take in these macromolecules, okay, so your carbohydrates, your lipids, your proteins, your nucleic acids. Those will be broken down in the digestive system if you have a stomach, which vertebrates do, so I've put stomach, but it's whatever the gut is. They'll be broken down into simple sugars like glucose, fatty acids, and glycerol can be broken down into glucose later on for energy, amino acids for the proteins, and nucleotides for the nucleic acids, and that's great because then you can use those to build either ATP or more DNA and RNA. Okay. Now, that N-CHOPS that I was telling you about actually makes up almost all of the cellular weight. And so you have, of course, most of it's water, but in this, the cellular weight here, right, H2O, yeah. But then here are your macromolecules. It's a huge, huge portion of, well, everything that's not water. Okay, that is it for this conversation about macromolecules. If you have any questions, ask me in class. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.